resource-rich province like Alberta, the demands of industry often have a major impact on our environment. Air and water quality, land use, the transportation and disposal of hazardous materials. These are all environmental issues that have developed along with our industrial base. Where the environment is concerned, sometimes the price of progress is compromise. The question is, how high a price should we and our children be willing to pay? Hello and welcome to Point of View. I'm your host, Ted Barris. If you've ever wondered about the real issues behind the news, then I think you'll enjoy this program. Each week, our panel of young people faces a studio guest who's an expert in his or her field, and together they examine the ideas and the events that shape our world. Today, our topic is the environment. We'll be trying to discover who is responsible for managing our environment, how we determine safe, acceptable use of the environment, what happens when we ignore environmental safeguards, and how we can ensure a balance between environmental and industrial concerns in our future. Our guest today is Linda Duncan, Executive Director of the Environmental Law Center. Welcome to Point of View, Ms. Duncan.
Thank you.
And we also want to welcome our panel, Darcy Keene, Barbara Glaude, and Don Vernon. Panel, first question really to you, because the environment is all around us. I'd like to throw this tug-of-war concept between development and environmental control and concern. Where have you seen it in your lives, Don?
Well, for example, in the move to enlarge the tar sands plant in Fort McMurray and the resulting increase in the quantities of pollutants which will be emitted into the air.
Very obvious potential problem. Barb?
Well, having lived most of my life in Calgary and watched it expand as a result of the oil industry, as the city moves out, the environmentalists come in when they see their land being taken up by the new industries moving.
Almost too late to make any impact.
Almost.
Yeah. Darcy?
Well, Ted, as a commerce student, I feel kind of a personal dilemma of possibly working for a company one day, which could potentially be threatening the very environment that I grew up with.
And it's a catch-22, isn't it?
Exactly.
Right. Well, we've talked a little bit about the possibility of spills. We hear about pipeline breaks and blowouts quite frequently in this province. And so the question about the responsibility comes up. We're going to look right now at an item from February 20th, 1985. Let's watch.
Liquefied natural gas continues to fuel the flames at the site of the pipeline leak, sending thick black smoke billowing into the air. 500 feet away from the flames sits a burnt-out station wagon, one of 3 vehicles driven here by a work crew sent to repair the leak Tuesday afternoon. The men were in the process of positioning repair equipment when a flash fire suddenly broke out, engulfing 5 of them.
What we think may have happened is that some of this propane migrated along the ground through the shallow locations and was ignited by some of our work equipment as it was being set up. Another possibility is that it may have spilled out under the snow and was undetected with our gas detectors.
This is a heavier than air cloud. It settles on top of the ground, okay? So whatever happened, it sort of exploded out of the ground and enveloped those people that were involved in it.
Investigators continue to probe the cause of both the leak and the flash fire, but it does appear as if the crew had taken proper safety procedures.
We feel at this time that we observed all safety precautions that we could. The crew had established upwind and up elevation, let's say, and was using the gas detectors to verify any explosive mixture.
Linda, as we have just seen, oil well was blown here. Who is responsible for setting the limits under which these companies operate? And in general, who is responsible for managing the environment for Albertans?
Well, it's not that simple of a question. We have a number of departments who are responsible for environmental protection, but essentially in areas such as pipelines. The Energy Resources Conservation Board is responsible for approving a type of pipeline that goes in and requiring certain safety standards, safety valves, and so forth. But Department of Environment is also responsible for making sure that pipelines don't cross over water courses or don't come too close to where people live and so forth.
Further question, what about the age of pipelines? Is there a body which oversees how old the pipelines are and ensures that they are replaced if they are too old?
Or safe.
Or safe?
That's a good question. I've never been asked that one about looking after old pipelines.
Well, it has been a national concern in terms of the National Canadian Pipeline. There was some concern about the authenticity of records regarding the welding that had been done in their initial insertion in the ground. So there are a lot of areas that maybe have yet to be covered. Maybe one of the questions that comes out of this story too is, could this accident have been prevented in terms of a better understanding of the responsibility?
Well, essentially, to come back to your question, Don, in Alberta, at least, monitoring of pipelines would be up to the industry. And that may have, cause for concern, because you rely on industry being reliable and, in fact, reporting any kind of problem that they see coming up. As I understand, they have some sort of X-ray machines that they take through the pipelines from time to time. And they also have to have safety valves at certain points in time, so that if there is an accident, if they suspect any kind of leak, then they can turn off those valves. And those are the kinds of things, when you're a citizen and you go to hearings, that you should watch for, because if it's a really dangerous substance, for example, hydrogen sulfide within the gas, you want to have those valves closer together so that the amount of gas that can come out is less, and less potential damage and harm.
I see. What about the general population? Does that mean that the Alberta government has given up on its responsibility to the general population?
Well, that's one interesting way to look at it. What they see it as is the Department of Environment has a very small budget, which is regrettable. But what they do is they pass on the responsibilities for the ongoing monitoring to the individual companies. But Alberta Environment and the Energy Resources Conservation Board also do surveillance checks, either monthly or yearly, whatever, depending on how hazardous the operation is.
Linda, would you say that there's a political element involved in who has charge of regulations? I mean, there's no question about the importance of the oil industry to Alberta. And would you say that the lack of regulations has something to do with that?
I'm not so sure that it is a case of lack of regulations. I think that the main problem that we have in this province and quite a few other provinces is lack of enforcement. I think that in most cases, if you took a look at our regulations, basically they're fairly good, although in some situations we have guidelines which are non-enforceable regulations. We could use a few more enforceable regulations.
So you're saying that the government has the guidelines which are passed along to the industry, but are not necessarily supervised by either government or industry?
Exactly.
Yeah, I'll re-put my question if I may then. Would you say the lack of enforcement that occurs has a political element to it?
Yes and no, not from necessarily any kind of malicious standpoint. But there is a very strong feeling within this province that economic and industrial development is more critical than environmental protection. So therefore, one may look upon the standpoint of we don't want to get industry upset about us, so instead we will negotiate with them instead of taking them to court.
Okay. Let's pursue this whole issue from another perspective and in another part of Alberta. Point of View has prepared a short report on Alberta's eastern slopes. Now, the eastern slopes comprise 90,000 square kilometers of mountains and foothills nestled against the Alberta Rockies. The region is rich in water, timber, wildlife, scenery, and mineral resources, and demands on the area for use of these resources have grown steadily over the years. In 1977, after consulting with industry, environmentalists, and the general public, the government published a policy for resource management of the eastern slopes. In 1984, the government released a revised Eastern Slopes policy. Environmentalists claim that the public was not asked for any input. They say that the revised policy is an about-face from the original and will have dire consequences for this very important area.
Linda, before we broke to the clip, you were saying that there's a compromise between industry and the government regulating. I know with the original Eastern Slopes policy this was the case, but what is it that's making the environmentalists so upset about the new Eastern Slope policy?
Well, in fact, I think the way that the public saw the previous policy was that there was no compromise. The result of the Environment Council of Alberta hearings was strong public sentiment in favor of preserving the eastern slopes, either for preserving it for wildlands, for elk and deer and bears and so forth, or for recreational purposes. As I understand, the adamant statements made during the course of those hearings was that they did not want resource extraction. The new policy, as I understand it, is this so-called balancing of uses, and that's what people are opposed to.
Does that mean, going back to Darcy's question, that maybe the oil and gas lobby in government or in government circles is stronger than the one that protects wildlife and the environment in the eastern slopes in a sort of recreational sense?
That may be the case, but I think the thing that has upset the environmental and naturalist organizations is that no one knows where the change came from, because it was made behind closed doors. And what they're saying is, fine, government has a right to change their policy, but we want it to be done within the public framework.
But that also means that the public didn't have a second crack at it the way the other
Exactly.
side of the coin did.
Exactly. Although we don't even know if this new policy was based on what the industrialists want. From what we understand, it came from within government itself.
Linda, couldn't that possibly just be a case of semantics? In reality, people such as your organization just aren't in favor of development, and they're couching it in those sort of terms, saying that, well, this wasn't a democratic process, when in reality all they're attempting to do is uphold development of any sort?
Well, you have to be careful when you say organizations such as ourselves, because we weren't directly involved in opposing the new policy. Where we have become involved is our concern about the way the policy was developed. And the Law Center feels very strongly that the development of all laws and policies dealing with the environment in this province should be done in consultation with those who are affected.
But doesn't the consultation process, if you make it too democratic, effectively reduce the ability to engage in any sort of development, because it just takes so long and is so involved?
I think that there are good arguments for that, but I think in this instance where you're talking about a very major policy which will affect all development in the long run, if you allow the public to have input into the overall policy, it could cut down on the time of hearings for individual developments.
But then take a look, for example, at some of the other parts in the province where there's been a lot of lobbying, a lot of concern expressed by individuals, say Pincher Creek about the sour gas development, say another example of Mount Allen being chosen for the 1988 Winter Olympic Games, and the concern that people are expressing for the effect that'll have on wildlife. There have been a number of times when the public, or it seems the public and these other lobby groups have expressed their concerns and nothing's happened. Whereas the minute it's oil and gas and that industry, all of the attention is focused, and it seems government stands up and listens.
Well, I certainly can't sit here and try to defend government, because I don't think that the position they took is defendable at all. I think that it is very important that public opinion be sought on critical policies of this nature. If we followed a strict policy of protecting the East Slopes, then we wouldn't have to worry about each individual application that came forward. Now what we have to worry about is the Eastern Slopes is divided into regions. So you as a citizen, if you happen to be interested in all of the Eastern Slopes, you have to participate in the planning processes for each one of those areas. I think even if you wanted to, you don't have a right to go to those hearings.
Linda, how do Albertans feel about the environment?
Well, one example to show where Albertans, at least Edmontonians, stand on environmental questions are, as we discussed earlier, a survey that was done through the University of Alberta but commissioned by Alberta Environment 2 years ago. And in that survey they asked people how they felt about enforcement of environmental laws and how they felt about the cost of enforcing environmental laws as compared to their own jobs. And I believe there were over 80% of those surveyed who believe that in all cases environmental standards should be enforced. And an astounding number of people, I don't remember the percentage, around 70%, believe that those laws should be enforced even if it meant that they lost their job.
Very interesting. So that means that it's a question of organization then. The problem is that the environmental groups or the environmental sentiment within the province is not organized enough to make an effective case to the government.
That could be the case. Interestingly, though, we now have more than 60 organizations throughout the province interested in environmental concerns, and they have now a very loose network of where they get together and exchange ideas. But we still do have a serious problem in how do we get our ideas across to the government. Americans, I think, are far more advanced. They know how to lobby government.
We're going to take another look at another issue that again brings us into the issue of control and law and legislation and blame. And we're going to take a look now at an incident that took place a couple of years ago and an update on it. We're going to have a look at an item that comes to us from December 19th, 1984. Let's have a look.
The oil company that is getting most of the blame for the lodgepole gas well blowout in 1982 is denying that it mishandled the incident. Amoco Canada is accused in the Energy Resources Conservation Board report on the well blowout of being ill-prepared to deal with the disaster. But Amoco insists it did the best job possible under the circumstances.
The lodgepole sour gas well blowout occurred on October 17, 1982, because of deficient drilling practices by Amoco Canada, according to the Energy Resources Conservation Board. The report released last night in Drayton Valley says Amoco drilling crews didn't immediately recognize the problems associated with the well and that several pieces of vital equipment did not function properly. The lodgepole well blew out of control for 2 months and killed 2 well fighters employed in the capping process. The ERCB slams Amoco for its handling of the lodgepole incident when just 5 years earlier it encountered another blowout just 5 miles away. Amoco spokesman Don Smith says the lodgepole incident was unique.
Geology of this particular area, regardless of the proximity of the two wells that blew out, is exceedingly complex, exceedingly difficult to predict. Our evaluation of the geology surrounding this particular well was thorough beforehand, and it was really based on the best information that we could get.
Peter Gregg, Vice President of the Canadian Association of Oil Drilling Contractors, says the lodgepole report will likely result in an upgrading of training standards in the industry.
Some of these areas need to be perhaps re-examined and maybe expanded, perhaps in the area of the conditions that occur during an emergency, so that people can be better prepared for the unusual things that happen.
Even with all the recommendations and the so-called learning experience, no one can guarantee there will never be another blowout again. As Smith puts it, the airline industry with all its technology cannot guarantee there will never be another plane crash. John Gulka, News First.
And with the ERCB report on the blowout now made public, provincial opposition leader Ray Martin has some strong words for the government rather than Amoco. The opposition leader believes Amoco may be taking a kicking in media reports, but he maintains the blame for the blowout should be directed at the Lougheed government.
It's the provincial government that has responsibility for sour gas development in the province. And people should not just think that Amoco was the only company, that somehow they are, if you like, the villains in this piece, because they're not. What they were doing was typical of the industry as a whole. And so the onus of what happened should not rest with Amoco, but should rest with the provincial government.
Linda, Ray Martin blames the government for conditions leading to the lodgepole incident. But to be fair, wasn't it just an accident, like any other accident that is inevitable to happen a certain percentage of the time in industry? And is it really fair to blame anybody for this sort of thing?
Yes, and the inquiry report that came out of the ERCB hearing very clearly laid blame, not only on Amoco, but also on various government agencies.
So if we could follow up on that a bit, you're saying that the government has been negligent, and we mentioned this a little earlier on, talking about political implications involved in this, but you're saying that the government is negligent in enforcing the regulations that are in fact there already?
Well, as a lawyer, I don't think that I can say that they've been negligent, but they certainly have been lax in developing better standards for response, emergency response, and both to procedures for prevention. As a result of the blowout, I think that a lot of new changes have come about, and while the blowout was regrettable, I think that the end result has been good for sour gas development. For example, the ERCB, the Energy Resources Conservation Board, have put through a number of amendments to their regulations and directives, and they've also called for quite a few reforms within other departments. But
regulation upon regulation, isn't this eventually going to result in completely hamstringing the ability of industry to take place in any sort of development?
Well, I think that other companies other than Amoco may express that sentiment, and it's unfortunate that one company's mistakes or lax behavior may result on heavier regulations and infringements on other industry, but that's the price that they bear. I think there's also a role for industry to play here in trying to be a little better watching their brother.
But isn't it, Linda, isn't it also true that even though there may be many regulations, and in trying to go through the regulations, it may cost the different industry a great deal of money, that nevertheless, in the long run, it is cheaper to have strong regulations as opposed to weak ones, whereby we'll have to pay even more money later on to clean up the mess?
I think that's an excellent point that you're making. It's all a question of who pays. It may be cheaper for industry to have laxer standards, but in the end run, the public has to pay for the cleanup. So in the long run, I think it's better to have a little bit more stringent regulations so that we don't have to pay the price.
Well, to be fair, Linda, what cleanup costs were there involved in the lodgepole incident? There's been no evidence that anybody was damaged. There's been no evidence that any injuries resulted.
That's true, but that's because no evidence was collected. I think that all parties have admitted that one of the saddest matters of the blowout was that because we didn't have standard procedures available for moving right in and doing a medical epidemiological study, we don't know what the impacts have been.
Should there be, though, a government set-up standard for emergency procedures and controls? Like, aren't industries independent upon where they're located and different conditions? per industry, not an overall blanket regulation?
There are certain blanket regulations, for example, drilling of sour gas. But as a result of the blowout, they have made those regulations even more stringent. I think that one matter of concern that remains, though, and that is, even though the government has now adopted certain guidelines for drilling of critical wells, it may be the case that perhaps we shouldn't be drilling some of those wells at all.
Linda, isn't it also true that the training programs for operators at the well sites is also crucial in ensuring that accidents of this nature do not reoccur?
That's quite true. I mean, there always is the human factor. But I don't think that we can totally blame the employees on the site. We also have to be concerned about, if a blowout occurs, what kind of emergency response plan is there to protect both them and the people nearby.
Does that mean that the regulations have to be agreed upon by all parties? It seems that we're talking about standards and regulations that are coming from 7 different directions that they can't be agreed upon. Do you think that would be the first thing they'd agree upon? Is what's safe and what's not?
Well, that is a problem, and that is something that the Environmental Law Center brought forward at the hearing, and in fact the inquiry agreed to, is that we need to get all of these agencies better coordinated and agreeing on what the standard should be.
Okay, one area where there is an attempt for coordination and direction is apparent from this next item we're going to have a look at. And what's this item from March the 6th of 1985? Let's look.
Canadian lead emission standards for automobile exhaust have been higher than U.S. standards for years. That has caused problems negotiating joint Canada-U.S. acid rain controls. Last year, the government announced Canadian standards would match American standards by the end of 1986. Today, Environment Minister Suzanne Blais-Grenier announced that as of September 1st, 1987, new cars and light trucks will have to carry improved pollution controls and run on unleaded gas. As well, the minister reaffirms a promise made by previous Liberal ministers to cut industrial sulfur dioxide pollution by 50%.
The 50% reduction by 1994 of sulfur dioxide emissions in eastern Canada is the largest tonnage cutback for acid rain in any nation. Our new motor emission standards are as tough as any other national standard and tougher than most.
Blais-Grenier is also allocating $150 million in new money for emission controls at Canadian smelters. The minister says over the next decade, the federal government will spend about $300 million to clean up acid rain.
Linda, acid rain certainly seems to be a problem in eastern Canada. The nickel mines of Sudbury immediately come to mind. But is it a problem in Alberta? And if so, what should we be doing now to avoid trouble in the future?
Well, I think that certainly is a debatable point, whether it is a problem here now. I think that if you ask some government authorities, they say that on average, we don't have a problem with sulfur dioxide emissions. But if you look at it on a regional or a local basis, we have some areas that are suffering from a lot of sulfur coming out of stacks. For example, when all of the tar sands area becomes developed to its potential, as I understand, that will be the largest source of acid-forming emissions in the entire country.
Is the government going to ensure that very stringent standards are employed at those plants?
Well, again, as was mentioned earlier by Darcy, a lot of these are political questions and answers. What that will depend on is whether or not Albertans take heed to what's going on in the north of the province. Unfortunately, it's not a highly populated area.
But we've seen some reaction even in the past couple of years with the various Indian bands concerned about their rivers being polluted. And that seems to be a signal already that people are concerned. We keep coming back to either blaming industry or government. No one seems to want to take the blame or take the responsibility for cleaning it up.
That's quite true. Well, I know that Chief Dorothy McDonald's band wants to have the same kinds of studies done in her area, or as are occurring in Pincher Creek in southern Alberta.
Does she really have legal recourse, as perhaps might the people in Lodgepole or the people in Pincher Creek or the people in Mount Allen, whatever? I mean, is there any, you as a lawyer, do you sense that the public in Alberta has, in its individual way or as a group, any recourse against the kind of pollution we're talking about, or potential pollution?
Well, one option, of course, is to try for private prosecution, which is what the Fort McKay Indian Band did in the Suncor case. They initiated a private prosecution, which is open to any citizen of the province to initiate.
Isn't acid rain an awfully difficult thing to take to prosecution because you're not sure exactly where it's coming from? We get a lot of it from the states up here. We get a lot of it from the provinces on either side. We can't really point at a company in Alberta in a lot of cases unless you live next door to one.
You're quite correct. I mean, half of the problem is the proof of the punch. You may be able to even prove that you are harmed, but how do you prove where it is coming from? I tend to think, though, that in Alberta, it isn't so much the same syndrome as in eastern Canada with acid rain. The complaints that we hear are more related to other substances that are coming out of the stack other than the sulfur, heavy metals, other toxics, which come out and leach into the soils. That's why we need to have important base information collected before those developments go in, so that down the line, after those plants have operated and you find that your stream is being polluted, you can go back and say, look, this river wasn't polluted before that plant went in, and now it is.
And you're suggesting that the government implement these base
well, they should certainly require that the companies undertake those studies, but governments themselves should also be doing baseline studies. It's unfair to expect one industry to do all of the baseline studies within a perimeter of several hundred miles.
Linda, what could a concerned young person do to help maintain or improve the environmental balance in Alberta?
Well, I think the important thing that they can do is just be aware. And when they see a serious problem, either report it to someone or bring it to somebody's attention. I think that's the most important factor, is to realize that your health is just as important as anybody else's, and no one has the right to harm you.
Okay, Ms. Duncan, if I can return to the acid rain issue again, because it is quite a contentious one in Canada today, and also talking about the individual's responsibility. Ted said that it's really an issue of the government being responsible or industry being responsible. But when we're dealing with political issues, such as angering the United States by demanding that they do something about their acid rain, isn't it also willingness on the part of individuals to take the repercussions of what those actions might be, as in reduced economic activity, higher unemployment, or whatever?
That may be the case, but I am quite disturbed when people suggest that you have to trade off either industrial development or environmental protection. It's just not the case.
So you think that there can be harmony between the two?
There certainly can, and I think that we just don't take enough time to think about protecting the environment.
Ms. Duncan and panel, thank you all for your points of view. We've run out of time. I want to thank you also for joining us today. If you at home would like to receive a copy of our program guide, you can write us at Point of View, care of Access Network, P.O. Box 3276, Station D, Edmonton, Alberta, T5L4J1, or you can call us at our toll-free number, 1-800-252-7999. My name is Ted Barris. Thank you very much for watching.